My granddaughter drew a man I buried 10 years ago. She handed me the paper with both hands, the way children offer things they are proud of, with the full presentation of someone who has made something and wants you to receive it properly. She was smiling. She had drawn him in crayon. Blue jacket, gray hair at the temples, the specific detail of a scar above the left eyebrow that no photograph I had ever shown her contained. No photograph anyone had ever taken contained, because the only people who knew about that scar were the people who had been close enough to see it in life, and one person who had been close enough to put him in the ground. She said, "Grandma, he visits me at night." My hands started shaking, not from fear, not immediately, from the specific disorienting collision of two realities that should not be able to occupy the same moment. The reality of my granddaughter's face, open and happy, holding out her drawing like a gift, and the reality of what the drawing contained. The face, the jacket, the scar. I was the only one who knew where he was buried. I want to say that clearly right now at the beginning before we go any further. I was the only one. Not because it was a secret that required keeping, though it was a secret and it did require keeping, and I kept it for 10 years with the specific discipline of someone who understood that the keeping was not optional. I was the only one because the circumstances of his death and burial were such that only one person could know. Me. And now my 6-year-old granddaughter was sitting across from me with a drawing of a dead man's face and telling me he came to her at night. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to stay with me because this story goes to places I did not expect when it started, and it requires that you have the whole shape of it to understand any single part. What I am about to tell you is not a ghost story, though it begins like one. It is not a supernatural story, though there are moments inside it that I cannot fully explain and have stopped trying to. It is a story about a secret kept for 10 years, about a child who drew a face, and about what happens when the past sends you a message through the most unexpected possible messenger. And before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you are listening from right now. Are you someone who is carrying something that only you know? Are you someone who has looked at a child and seen something in them that stopped you completely? I read every comment, every single one, because this story belongs to everyone who has ever understood that the past is not as finished as we need it to be. Stay with me. Every word matters. Let me start at the beginning, not the drawing, not the night she told me about the visitor, all the way back to who he was and what he did and why I was the one who put him in the ground. His name was Raymond Hollis, and the first thing you need to understand about Raymond is that he was, by every public measurement available, a good man, a respected man, the kind of man whose name appeared in the church bulletin and whose face was known at the school gates and whose opinion was sought at community meetings because he had a way of saying things that made other people feel that the correct course of action had been identified and all that remained was to follow it. He was 63 when he died. He had been my husband for 31 of those years. I need to take a breath here and say something that I have never said in the full version to any single person. What I am about to tell you is the truth, the complete truth, in the way that I have only ever told it to myself and to the hole in the ground and to whatever is beyond that. I am telling it now because I have carried it for 10 years, and because of what my granddaughter drew, and because I have come to understand that secrets do not decompose the way bodies do. They persist. They find ways out. They handed themselves to a 6-year-old with crayons, and she gave them to me with a smile. Raymond Hollis was not a good man. He was a man who had built a very good performance of a good man, which is a different thing entirely, and which requires considerably more effort and considerably more cruelty to maintain than simply being good would have required. The performance required that the people around him believe in a version of him that was consistently, fundamentally false. It required the management of information, what people knew, what people didn't know, what people saw, and what they were guided away from seeing. It required, most importantly, the management of me. I was the primary audience for the performance and simultaneously the person whose testimony could have ended it. This made me both essential and dangerous to him, which is a combination that produces in certain men a very specific response. Control so thorough and so practiced that the person being controlled eventually loses the ability to identify the boundaries of it. I lived inside Raymond's control for 26 of our 31 years together. The first 5, I want to say this because it is true, the first 5 were different. Not perfect, but different. I will not give you the detailed inventory of what those 26 years contained, not because I am protecting him. I am not protecting him. I am very deliberately not protecting him, which is why I am telling this story at all, but because the inventory is not the point. The point is what it built, and what it built was this: a woman who had spent 26 years having her reality managed, her perceptions questioned, her testimony preemptively discredited by a man who was very good at being believed, arriving at a night that I had not planned and had not wanted, and that happened anyway with the terrible, inevitable logic of things that had been building for a very long time. What happened on that night? I will tell you. I will tell you clearly and without the softening that I spent years applying to it, because softening was the habit survival had made. Raymond came home in a state that I had learned across 26 years to read the way a sailor reads weather. There was a kind of certainty in him on those nights that was more frightening than the anger, the certainty of a man who has decided that what is about to happen is justified and who has therefore released himself from any remaining restraint. I had a daughter in the house. She was 18. She was home from college for the weekend. She was upstairs. He came toward me in the kitchen. I had a knife in my hand. I had been cutting vegetables. I was making a meal. I was doing the ordinary thing. I was in my kitchen doing what I had always done. He came toward me with that certainty, and I will not describe the specific sequence of the following 40 seconds because I want to be careful about what I say that could be misunderstood, and because what happened in those 40 seconds has been examined by me from every angle for 10 years, and the examination always arrives at the same place. I was not going to be on the floor. Not that night. Not with my daughter upstairs. He died in my kitchen on a Thursday evening in October. The knife was the mechanism. The 26 years were the cause. I will not tell you where I buried him because there are still technically legal considerations that have not been fully resolved by the passage of time, and my solicitor, who I eventually told in year 7 in the specific context of a conversation about what would happen after my own death and what my granddaughter should and should not eventually know, my solicitor has advised me with some care on what I can and cannot say publicly. What I will tell you is that it was on land that I had access to, that it was prepared with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that thoroughness was not optional, and that in 10 years nothing has surfaced. My daughter came downstairs 20 minutes after it happened. She saw me. She did not see him. I told her he had left, that there had been an argument and he had left, and I did not know when he was coming back. She was 18 and had spent her own years reading the weather of that house, and she looked at me with eyes that contained more understanding than I wanted them to, and she said, "Okay, Mom." Just that. And then she helped me clean the kitchen without being asked. She has never asked me what happened that night, not in 10 years. I have never told her. We have existed in the shared knowledge of the not saying in the way that people who love each other sometimes can, which is imperfectly and with cost, but also with a kind of grace that I do not know how to name, but am grateful for. Raymond was reported as a missing person. He was not extensively searched for, I will say this. He was a man who had professional difficulties that were not publicly known, but were known to certain people in his life, and the working assumption of those people, including the officers who took the initial report, seemed to be that a man with those difficulties had chosen to become unavailable rather than face them. The investigation was not aggressive. It was closed within 18 months. He has been listed as a missing person for 10 years. That is who Raymond Hollis was. That is where he is, and that is why I was the only person who could have known what my granddaughter had drawn. My granddaughter's name is Clara. She is 6 years old. She is my daughter Nadia's child. Nadia married a quiet, steady man named Philip 8 years ago, and they have built the kind of life I always wanted for her, the kind I was trying to protect when I was standing in my kitchen on that Thursday in October. Clara is their only child. She is small for her age and has her mother's eyes and her father's patience, and a quality of attention that I have noticed in her from very early, the specific attentiveness of a child who is always taking things in, always processing, always filing the world with a seriousness that sits slightly at odds with the crayon drawings and the gaps in her front teeth. She is not a fanciful child. This is important, and I want to say it clearly. Clara does not have an extensive imaginary life. She does not have imaginary friends. She does not tell stories that are elaborate fabrications. She is the kind of child who says what she means and means what she says. When she tells you something, it is because she has experienced something she is reporting on. This is her character. It has been her character since she was old enough to have a character. She began talking about the visitor approximately 3 months before the drawing. She mentioned him first in passing, the way children mention things that are ordinary to them and have not yet been flagged as noteworthy by an adult's reaction. She was sitting at breakfast at Nadia's house, and she said, without particular emphasis, "The man came again last night." Nadia, who was making toast and half listening, said, "What man, sweetheart?" And Clara said, "The one who stands at the window." Nadia looked up. She said, "What window?" Clara said, "My window." And then she went back to her cereal. Nadia told me about this conversation on the phone that evening. She was not alarmed, not yet, not fully. She was in the specific uncertain territory of a parent who has heard something from a child that requires calibration. Is this imagination? Is this a dream? Is this something to take seriously? She told me because she tells me things, because we are close in the way of people who have shared more than most mothers and daughters share and have built from that shared weight a considerable honesty. I said, "What did he look like?" Nadia said, "She didn't say. I didn't ask. I didn't want to make it into a thing if it was just a dream." I said, "Ask her." She heard something in my voice. She knows my voice across 40 years, and she heard something in it that she was not expecting. She said, "Mom, is everything all right?" I said, "Ask her what he looks like and call me back." She called me back 20 minutes later. She had asked Clara, casually over the context of goodnight preparations, in the way of a parent who has learned to ask things indirectly so that the asking doesn't become bigger than the answer. She had asked what the man at the window looked like. Clara had said, "Old, not as old as great-grandpa. He has gray hair." She had pointed, Nadia told me, to her own temples. "And he has a mark here." She had pointed above her left eyebrow. Nadia said, "She said he has a mark above his eyebrow. Mom, why does that matter? You've gone very quiet." I said, "It doesn't. I'm just tired. Kiss Clara for me." And then I sat in my chair for a long time in the dark, and I thought about things I had not thought about in 10 years with the specific, focused attention of someone who has just discovered that the door they sealed is not as sealed as they believed. The drawing happened 6 weeks after that phone call. Clara was at my house for the afternoon. Nadia and Philip had a commitment. I collected Clara from school and brought her home, and she sat at my kitchen table with the crayons I keep in the drawer for exactly this purpose, and she drew while I made tea. This is an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in our relationship. It has been ordinary for 4 years. She draws, I make tea. We exist in the comfortable quiet of a child and her grandmother who know each other well enough to not require constant conversation. I was not watching her draw. I was at the counter thinking about other things, listening to the sound of the kettle and the sound of crayons on paper, and feeling the specific warmth of an afternoon that is exactly what it appears to be. And then she said, "Grandma, I made him for you." I turned around. She was holding the paper out with both hands, the full presentation, the proud child offering. And I saw the face. He was drawn in the way of a 6-year-old, not photorealistic, not detailed in the way of a trained hand, but in the way of a child who has seen something clearly and has reproduced it with the specific accuracy of someone drawing from direct observation rather than imagination. The blue jacket, the gray at the temples, exactly where Clara had pointed on herself, and above the left eyebrow, in brown crayon, careful, deliberate, a mark, a scar. I took the paper. I held it. I kept my face still in the way I have kept my face still across many situations that required stillness, and I said, "Who is this?" She said, "The man who visits me. I told you about him." I said, "Where does he visit you?" She said, "At night. He stands by the window sometimes. Sometimes he's just there when I wake up. He doesn't talk." She looked at the drawing with the evaluative expression of a child assessing their own work. "He looks sad. That's why I made him for you. I thought you might know him." I thought you might know him. I looked at my granddaughter across the kitchen table. She was 6 years old. She had crayon on her left hand, the way she always does, because she's left-handed and drags her hand through the fresh marks. She was looking at the drawing with kind, serious eyes. She had no idea what she had handed me. She had simply seen something and reported it and made it into a gift. I said, very carefully, "Why did you think I might know him?" She said, "He told me." Everything in the room went very still. I said, "He told you to show the drawing to me." She nodded. She said, "He said, give it to Grandma. He said she'll know what to do." She'll know what to do. I folded my hands in my lap so that she could not see them shaking. I said, "You said he doesn't talk." She said, "Not always. Sometimes he does, just a little." She picked up a green crayon and began drawing something new. "He said your name. He said, Miriam." My name which Raymond had said in every register possible across 31 years, in love, in the early years that were different, and in the later years in the specific tone of someone using a name as a form of management. My name, said by a dead man to my 6-year-old granddaughter who had reproduced his face in crayon and handed it to me across a kitchen table. I put the drawing face down on the table. I went to the counter, I poured the tea, I sat across from Clara, and I watched her draw a green thing that might have been a tree or a person or an idea that did not yet have a form, and I stayed very still. And I thought. I did not tell Nadia immediately. This was the first decision, and I made it, consciously, with full awareness that it might be the wrong decision, because I have learned over years that conscious wrong decisions are at least decisions you can account for, whereas unconscious ones compound. I did not tell Nadia because Nadia does not know what happened on the Thursday in October 10 years ago. She was 18. She came downstairs. She helped me clean the kitchen without being asked. She has never asked. I have never told. And the conversation that would follow, telling her about the drawing, would be unavoidably a conversation that contained the drawing's full context. I was not yet ready to have that conversation. I needed to understand what was happening before I handed it to someone else to process. So I did what I have always done when I need to understand something. I sat with it, turned it over, looked at it from every angle available to me. I am not a believer in the supernatural. I want to say this not as a dismissal of what Clara experienced. I believe completely that Clara experienced something, that something visited her, that she drew what she saw. I believe her without qualification, but I am a woman who has lived inside a great deal of human darkness and has come to understand that the most frightening things wear human faces and have human causes. My instinct, even with a dead man's face on a piece of paper in front of me, was to look for the human explanation before the supernatural one. So I looked. The first question, had Clara seen a photograph of Raymond? I went through this methodically. There were no photographs of Raymond in my house. I had removed them all in the weeks after that October, partly for practical reasons and partly because I could not live with them. There were no photographs of Raymond at Nadia's house. She had removed hers quietly over the years following his disappearance without comment, in the way she handles most things. Philip had never met Raymond, the school, the playground, Clara's world. Raymond had been dead for 4 years before Clara was born. There was no pathway I could identify through which a photograph of Raymond could have reached Clara. The second question, had someone told Clara about Raymond, described him to her, deliberately or accidentally, in enough detail that she had constructed his face from description? This required thinking about who Clara was around: family, school, neighbors. My side of the family knew Raymond, but we did not discuss him. Nadia's deliberate silence on the subject of her father had, over 10 years, communicated itself to the people around her. Philip knew only that Nadia's father had disappeared and that the subject was not one Nadia engaged with. Clara had never been told she had a grandfather on her mother's side who had disappeared. The conversation had been deferred consistently with the intention of having it when Clara was older. No one had described Raymond to Clara. No one had enough knowledge of his specific physical details, the scar above the left eyebrow specifically, to have described him accurately. The scar was not visible in any photographs because Raymond had possessed the self-conscious vanity of a man who managed his image carefully and had never allowed the scar's angle to be caught in a picture. The third question, which took me longer to formulate, was someone using Clara? This is the question I found most disturbing to ask because it required imagining a cruelty directed at a 6-year-old as a vehicle. But I am someone who has learned not to exclude possibilities because they are disturbing. Was there a person, alive, human, with knowledge of Raymond and with a motive who was accessing Clara in some way and planting these experiences? Someone who knew enough about Raymond to know about the scar, who had reason to want me destabilized, and who understood that the most effective way to deliver a message to me was through my granddaughter? I thought about who was still alive who had known Raymond well. His brother, Dennis, who had never liked me, and who had made in the first 2 years after Raymond's disappearance noises about the investigation that I had taken seriously and that had eventually come to nothing. Raymond's business associate, a man named Carl, who had more knowledge of Raymond's financial situation than most, and who had, I had heard through the occasional community connection, remained active in the area. 1 or 2 people from Raymond's past who had known him before I did, and who I had always, at Raymond's instruction, kept at a careful distance. Either of these people, if they knew something or suspected something, might have reason to approach the situation indirectly, might have found a way to put something in front of a child that the child would carry to me. The scar. How many people knew about the scar? Raymond's brother would have known, the doctor who stitched it decades ago, perhaps others I could not account for. I could not resolve the question. I had 2 possibilities and evidence for neither. A 6-year-old who was genuinely visited by something I could not explain, or a 6-year-old who was being used by someone I had not yet identified. Both of these possibilities required action. The actions they required were different. I needed more information before I could determine which action to take. I picked up the phone. I called my solicitor. Miriam Ellsworth has handled my affairs for 19 years. She is 71 now, sharp, precise, economical with words in the way of someone who has learned that the right word, placed correctly, does more work than 20 words placed approximately. She knows what happened on the Thursday in October. She has known since year 7 when I told her in the specific context I described earlier, and she has carried it with the professional composure of someone who has been practicing family law for 40 years and who understands that the people who need solicitors are not always people who have done straightforward things. I went to her office, I brought the drawing, I sat across from her desk, and I placed it in front of her, and I told her everything. The phone conversation with Nadia, the breakfast mention of the man at the window, the afternoon at my kitchen table, the blue jacket and the gray temples, and the scar, and the words she said he had said. She'll know what to do. Miriam. Miriam looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. She turned it once, as though a different angle might offer new information. Then she placed it flat on the desk and folded her hands and looked at me. She said, "You've considered the human explanation." I said exhaustively. She said, "Dennis or Carl?" I said, "Those are the most likely." She said, "What would be the purpose if it's one of them?" I said, "I have thought about this. If someone suspects what happened, has suspected for 10 years and has not been able to act on the suspicion and wants to destabilize me into making a mistake, or wants to signal that they know, or wants to extract a confession or a reaction that they can use, using Clara is an indirect route that gives them distance from any accusation. She's a child. She says a man visited her. She drew a face. How do I accuse anyone of anything? What would I say?"
Margaret said, "Precisely." She picked up a pen. "Which means if it is a human actor, the strategy depends on your responding to the instability, making contact, making a mistake." I said, "Yes." She said, "And if it is not a human actor?" I said, "Then I need to understand what it is and what it wants." She looked at me for a moment with the expression she uses when she is about to say something that is outside the usual territory of a solicitor-client relationship, but which she has decided needs to be said. She said, "Miriam, in 40 years of practice, I have sat across from a great number of people who have done things they did not expect to do and have lived with those things in various ways. Some of them, toward the end of that living, have found that what they carried needed somewhere to go that was not just themselves, that the carrying was," she paused, selecting the word, "unfinished." I said, "You think this is about my conscience?" She said, "I think it might be about several things at once. A child, your conscience, whatever Raymond was and whatever he did and whatever happened in your kitchen on that night. I think it might be about the fact that you have carried something alone for 10 years that was too large for one person and that has found its own way to ask for a different arrangement." I looked at the drawing, the blue jacket, the gray temples, the scar. I said, "What different arrangement?" She said, "That, I think, is the question you need to answer." I told Nadia on a Sunday. Not impulsively, I had spent 3 weeks after the meeting with Margaret in a kind of deliberate preparation, the way you prepare for something you have known was coming for a long time and have been finding reasons to delay. I had been finding reasons to delay for 10 years. The drawing had removed them. We sat at her kitchen table. Philip took Clara to the park. I had asked Nadia to arrange this without explaining why, and she had arranged it without asking why, because this is who we are to each other. I made coffee. I sat across from my daughter, who is 40 now, who has her father's height and my eyes and a quality of composure that is entirely her own, and I told her the truth about the Thursday in October. All of it, from the beginning to the kitchen to the ground. Every part of it that I had carried alone for 10 years and that had arrived at her kitchen table via a crayon drawing made by her daughter. She listened. She did not interrupt. She is not a person who interrupts. She waits until the full shape of a thing is present before she responds to it, which is one of the qualities I am most grateful she developed, and one that I recognize did not come from nowhere. People who grow up in houses where interruption is dangerous learn to let things fully arrive before they respond. She had learned that. She was using it now. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. The coffee cooled between us. Outside somewhere, I could hear a bird making the specific, insistent sound of a bird with something to communicate. Nadia said, "I knew something happened." I said, "I know you did." She said, "I didn't know what. I thought—" She stopped. She started again. "I thought that it was possible that you had done something. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I think I made a choice not to find out because finding out felt like something I couldn't contain." I said, "I know." She said, "He hurt you?" Not a question. I said, "Yes." She said, "For a long time?" I said, "Yes." She was quiet again. Then she said in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice, but not fragile. Contained is the word. The way something small can be very contained, very deliberately itself. She said, "I'm not sorry he's gone." I said, "Neither am I." She said, "I'm sorry you've been carrying it alone." I said, "So am I." We sat for a while longer. The coffee was cold. Neither of us moved to warm it. At some point, her hand crossed the table and covered mine. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand placed on a hand, the specific gesture of two people who are in the same place and choosing to acknowledge it. She said, "What do we do about Clara?" I said, "I think that depends on what is actually happening with Clara." She said, "Do you believe her?" I said, "I believe that she has experienced something real. Whether that something has a human explanation or not, I have not been able to determine. But I think what it is asking for, either way, is for things to stop being carried alone." Nadia looked at me for a long moment. The whole Raymond, the one who was charming and present in the first 5 years, and the one who became what he became in the years after, and the one who came toward me in the kitchen on that Thursday with that specific certainty. I thought about whether I believed in anything that could be called peace for such a person. Whether the answer to that was different from what I would have said 10 years ago, when I was full of the specific, exhausted anger of someone who has just survived something they should not have had to survive. I said, "I think he is what he was, and I think the only peace available to any of us is the peace we make, not with him, with ourselves." She nodded slowly. She said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." Philip brought Clara back an hour later. She came in with the specific, energized dishevelment of a child who has been to the park and done everything the park had to offer. She climbed onto my lap. She still does this at 6, and I am aware that the window for it is closing, and I sit still and receive it completely every time. She put her arms around my neck. She said into my ear quietly, "Did you figure out what to do, Grandma?" I held her. I said, "Yes, sweetheart, I think I did." She said, "Good." And then she wriggled off my lap and went to find her crayons, and that was that. The completeness of children, the way they deliver enormous things and move on because they are always moving, always on to the next thing, because they have not yet learned to sit inside a moment long enough for it to become a weight. Clara has not mentioned the visitor since the drawing. I do not know what to make of that. I have turned it over many times in the way I have turned everything over, looking for the explanation, the mechanism, the human cause or the other kind. I have not found it. I have found instead something that is harder to categorize than an explanation, and perhaps more useful, a kind of release. Not resolution. I do not think what happened in my kitchen 10 years ago is the kind of thing that resolves, but release. The easing of a pressure that I had normalized so completely that I had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. I told Nadia, that is what changed. That is what the drawing asked for, in whatever way it was asking. The voice of a child who said she'll know what to do, and then drew a face that would make it impossible for me to keep not doing it. Whether Raymond sent that, whatever version of sending is available to the dead, or whether something in my own accumulated carrying found a way to externalize itself through the most innocent and open channel available, or whether a 6-year-old simply dreamed something that she happened to draw with crayon accuracy, I cannot tell you. I have stopped requiring myself to be able to tell you. Some things do not resolve into explanation. They resolve into action. The action was, tell Nadia. I told Nadia, and Nadia said, I'm not sorry he's gone. And I said, neither am I. And her hand covered mine across the table, and the 10 years shifted, not ended, shifted, became a different weight, shared rather than singular, which does not half it, but does change its character entirely. There are still questions. Dennis and Carl, I have not yet determined whether either of them was behind anything involving Clara, whether there is a human mechanism I have not yet uncovered. Margaret is quietly attentive to this. If something surfaces, we will deal with it. We are prepared to deal with it in ways that we were not prepared before, because preparation requires knowing what you are preparing for, and I now know the full shape of what I am in. Raymond's body is where it is. I will not move it. I will not confess it. I am 62 years old, and I am my daughter's mother and my granddaughter's grandmother, and I am in the last third of a life that has been harder than it should have been, and more sustaining than I sometimes allowed myself to notice. I am not going to spend what remains of it in a courtroom accounting for a Thursday in October. What I am going to do is be here, for Nadia, for Philip, for Clara with her crayons and her serious eyes and her capacity to carry messages that full-grown adults could not have delivered. She handed me the drawing with both hands. She smiled. She said she thought I might know him. I knew him, and now I know what to do. If you are listening to this right now, if you are someone who is carrying something alone that has become so familiar you have stopped feeling its weight, I want to say this to you with the full knowledge of someone who carried something for 10 years and did not understand what the carrying was costing until a child drew a face and gave it to me with a smile. Find the person you can tell. Not necessarily everyone, not necessarily the whole world, but someone. The one person whose hand can cover yours across a table. The one person who can say, I know and I'm not sorry and I'm here, without making it smaller or larger than what it actually is. The carrying alone is the weight. The telling is not the weight. The telling is the beginning of being able to put it down. Put it down. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, please do it now, because these stories, the ones that live in the difficult, honest, unglamorous places of real human experience, these stories deserve to be told and heard and shared. Subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it means that every person who needs to hear that they are not alone in the things they carry will have a place to come. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what you are carrying. Tell me about the moment something found its way to the surface in a way you didn't expect. I will be reading. I always am.